I had just moved into my first apartment after college, which I've since moved out of for many reasons, this being one of them. It was kind of dated, but pretty cheap, so whatever. The only weird thing was that my bedroom didn't have any windows, when every other apartment in the complex does. Besides that, it was a pretty normal place. A month or two went by with nothing to mention, when one Saturday, there was a knock on the door. I answered it, and some strange-looking woman with long, scraggly blonde hair was there. Her eyes were freakishly wide. She said, "Hello, I used to live here. The bedroom has no windows." I was like, okay. "Can I see the bedroom? Please, just one last time." "No, please leave." I was starting to close the door on her when she slammed her hand on the door and exclaimed some sort of psycho babble about not letting them see in. I slammed the door in her face and locked it, but I was on the first story, so she just walked around to my living room window and kept screaming and pounding on it. I went back out with a broom to chase her off. It would actually be mildly humorous if it wasn't so weird. I was a little freaked out, but went about my day. The next morning, I woke up and walked out into the living room to see a figure at the window, wide-eyed and with scraggly hair. She saw me and started screaming. I called the cops, then the landlord. The cops showed up and escorted her away while the landlord apologized. I was obviously shaken up, so he let me hang out in the office for a while. He assured me that she wouldn't be coming back. I started asking questions, and apparently she was telling the truth. She did used to live in my apartment, but was totally crazy. She drew eyes and wrote stuff on the walls. The landlord found out and kicked her out, and had it all painted over. My cousin always has weird stuff happen to him. He tells me these stories of things he sees at night and voices he hears. It's almost like a weekly thing that something happens to him. I was at his house by myself once, and this is probably the creepiest thing that happened to me. I was about 16 and lifting weights in his basement. No one was home, and when I was done, I decided to shower there. I was showering on the second floor when I heard a knocking on the bathroom door. The knocking startled me, but I figured his mom or dad had come home and wanted to see who was showering. I asked, "Who is it?" "Open up." It was his dad's voice. I cracked open the door and peeked out to see what he wanted, and no one was there. I finished showering and went into my cousin's room. I was getting dressed when I heard the same knock pattern on his closet door. I paused for a few seconds, then asked, "Who is it?" It said, "Open up," in his dad's voice. I left the house, and I noticed as I went that there were no other cars there. When I was a kid, my mom used to send me to this week-long summer camp every year to make friends. It consists of 3 buildings that are something over 100 years old. The main one, where we spent a few hours of the day, was the barracks where we slept, boys and girls in different sections, and the bathhouse was a bit away from the other 2 buildings, at the end of a small gravel path. The first day went normally, and I did make some friends. On the second night, we asked one of the leaders to tell us stories. He told us this horror story about the barracks. Apparently, they had a cellar where they used to store potatoes when the building was new. He told us that the original owner's daughter had died in the cellar. Everybody acted tough. He left, and we started talking about the cellar, and decided that one of us should go down there. I was the one. The cellar was a restricted area, so I had to be sneaky. The next night, I said that I needed to use the bathroom. When I left, I walked behind the barracks and opened the doors to the cellar. They looked like the kind of doors you'd see on a tornado shelter in the ground. I went down the stairs, and it was so dark. It took a while for my eyes to get used to the darkness. As soon as they did, the door slammed shut. I was terrified and tried to scream for help, but I couldn't. I couldn't push the door open either. It was stuck. I decided to look around at what was in the cellar. It was just ropes and bags and more bags. All of a sudden, I heard something. I couldn't see anything moving, but I knew there must be something down here. I could hear it. Terrified, I backed into the corner, and I realized what it was. Voices. Whispers. After a while, the camp leaders started searching for me. One of the other boys told them that I was in the cellar. They came and got me out and asked how I had gotten in, when there was a lock on the door and bricks on top of it. All in all, I spent around 15 minutes down there with the voices. This happened in the late fall, in northern New England. It was cold, and there was an inch of snow or 2 on the ground, and the roads were a little icy. My brother-in-law came up for a weekend during rifle deer season. We were planning to get out really early the next morning, so we hit up Walmart the night before for a few things. I live in the middle of nowhere, so Walmart is about 45 minutes away. It was about 9:30 p.m. when we left, so well past dark. We got what we needed and headed back. It was probably about 10:45 or so by then. We headed up a long, single-lane road that doesn't get much traffic, when we saw an animal that got hit by a car off to the side of the road, still partially in the lane. From a distance, it looked like a medium or large dog, so I slowed down. As we got closer, though, I realized it was a giant, and I mean freaking giant rabbit or hare. As we drove around, it picked its head up and turned it in a really unnatural way, to watch us go by. A few seconds of silence passed, and my brother-in-law eventually said, "Dude, did we just see an undead rabbit?" We were really creeped out, and it was a mostly silent ride home. When we got home, my wife was already in bed. I got ready for bed and laid down next to her, and she said, "I'm glad you're home. I was really worried." I asked her why she was worried, and she said, "Because of the big rabbit." I got the worst chills of my life and shot straight up. I asked her how she knew about that, and she didn't answer. I shook her shoulder, and she just moaned sleepily. Turns out she was talking in her sleep. She doesn't remember saying anything. In 12th grade, I had a spare period and would use it to relax in a sort of side hallway area. There was never any light, except for some natural light coming in through the windows. There was carpeting and benches there because some of the smaller, less popular cliques of students would eat lunch there all the time. I was reading some awesome science fiction, lying on my back and using a jacket as padding and my backpack as a pillow. As I did, a dude with a bald head peered around the corner. I looked over the top of my book, ignored him, and went back to reading. A few minutes later, I looked again, and the same dude was still leaning around the corner. I said, "I have a spare, man. I like this place, so I read here." The man didn't reply. I just said, "Whatever," and went back to reading. A few weeks later, I was in the same place and situation. After a while, I felt a sensation of being watched. I looked over my book and saw the same dude in the same position. I said, "Hey, still reading. Am I in the way or something?" Once again, there was no reply. Once more, I said whatever and went back to reading. This happened several more times. I never thought much of it because I was always considered weird. During my last year there, I took a couple of extra years to get in some classes I hadn't been able to before. A friend told me about a janitor that had apparently died when he was in his 40s and loved the school. I looked him up, and the dude I'd been seeing for the last few years looked exactly like him. He'd been dead since about a decade before I was there. A couple of years back, I was pulling an all-nighter at the job because we were doing some upgrades for a client and the servers had crashed. I ended up working from 9 a.m. on a Wednesday to 9 a.m. on the next Thursday, with no extra pay. I remember once we had finished, me and a coworker just wanted to go home and sleep, since we still had to go to work that day, though we were allowed to arrive late. So we split up at the subway station, and he took a bus home while I took the subway. So people were barely getting up and about while I was just going home. And needless to say, I was extremely tired and my eyes felt iffy at best. I recall that once I was inside the station, I was just standing there waiting for the train when the lights went out and the PA came on. I didn't pay much attention, but he said something about technical problems and a 5-minute delay. Then, I could hear somebody walking into the room where the PA system was, and somebody whispering to the guy that they saw it again on the rails. The conductor was sent home before it went off. I've no idea what that was, but back then, I lived in one of the world's biggest metropolitan areas, and stories about how stuff happens right before people go off to work were always a thing. About 4 years ago, I lived in this creepy 70s-era house in the downtown part of town. My cousin came over from Ontario and he needed a place to stay for a couple of nights, so we let him sleep in one of our guest bedrooms. We had about 3 extra bedrooms, but we were going through some renovations, so he had to stay in this creepy, bright baby blue room beside mine. There was no bed in there, so he slept on a mattress. Sometime during the night, he burst into my room, shivering and in a cold sweat. He looked terrified. He just crumpled onto the floor and lay there. I don't know if he slept at all. Fast forward a year. Some friends and I were having a sleepover, and I told them the cousin story. One of my friends came up with the bright idea to try and sleep in the blue room. So when the time came, we all piled onto the queen-sized mattress, and eventually we all fell asleep. I awoke to the feeling of worms crawling all over me. Both my friends were gone and the door of the blue room was closed. I started thrashing around wildly. Then I started gagging. It felt like worms were squirming out of my every orifice. I got up and searched for the doorknob, but I couldn't find it. I felt around for the light switch and then, bam! Let there be light. In an instant, all of the squirming ceased. I looked around for a few moments, and there were no worms in sight. I dashed out the door, scared witless, only to meet up face to face with my 2 friends. They asked me what happened, and I summed it up. They told me they had basically the same experience. Fast forward again another week. I walked into the blue room, and the floor actually was covered in worms. I was walking home from a late-night snack run. It was about 2 a.m., and dark and foggy because it had just rained. I was walking down a highway that was usually busy, but right now was deserted. There were thick woods on the other side of the highway, and it was so dark I could hardly see anything. I was kind of zoning off on the walk back, which usually took about 10 to 15 minutes, when I heard this whooping sound. I had lived in the area for over 10 years, and had never heard anything like it. I briefly thought it might be something like a monkey or a tropical bird, but in the American Northeast at 2 in the morning, both were rather unlikely. I kept hearing it, and eventually realized it was coming from the woods across the highway. I started scanning to see if I could make out anything in the dark. After a moment, I realized there was a silhouette. At first I thought it was a bear, then realized there hadn't been a bear sighted in the area for decades. It wasn't moving at all. Then I started to think it was a tree, but it wasn't shaped like a tree. All I could make out was this massive silhouette, taller than I am, standing perfectly still next to a street sign. The Scooby-Doo part of my brain wanted to go investigate, while the more rational part reminded me that all I had to defend myself with was a cheap plastic umbrella. The whooping continued, louder and louder, while the shape just stood there motionless. Eventually, I resolved to keep walking normally, while still keeping an eye on it, and if it so much as twitched, I would run as fast as I could. The whole way down the road, it was still just standing there motionless, and the whooping sound gradually faded into the distance behind me. It's under a street lamp, so the light restored some confidence. I chuckled to myself about what a moron I was, how it must have been a tree or something, and continued down the road to my house. I could just start to see my house in the distance when I heard another muffled whoop behind me. I turned around just in time to see a shadow pass in front of the streetlight way off in the distance, briefly blocking out its light. I realized that this street lamp was about 10 feet off the ground. I decided to forget acting manly. I turned and sprinted as fast as I could for my house. I wish I could say I heard footsteps and growling behind me to make this more exciting, but it was dead quiet, save for the constant whooping which was getting louder and louder. I threw myself into my front door. Thankfully, I put 99 points into dexterity and got the lock open on the first try. I threw the door shut behind me and deadbolted it. Without hesitation, I went through the house, making sure every door and window was firmly secured. By the third round, I realized that now I could only hear that whooping faintly in the distance. But throughout the night, I'd hear it regularly at different points around me. It sounded like the distance varied for miles around. I still have no idea what exactly it was. I went out that way again during the day, and where I saw the silhouette, there's nothing. Just a blank patch of grass. I don't know if it was a bunch of guys hiding under a tarp or the biggest bear in America, but whatever it was moved on for some time in the night. This is why I don't go walking alone at night anymore. When I was 8 years old, we were having a New Year's Eve party at my home. It's about 150 years old, and actually used to be a convent where nuns lived. I was hanging out in the basement with my older sister and her friends, while everyone else was upstairs watching the ball drop. Suddenly, the lights all went out. The only light we could see was from a lantern that was on in a corner down the hallway. I looked through a large square section cut out of the wall that looked toward the staircase leading upstairs, and I saw a full-body shadow of what looked like a female figure wearing a headdress. It wasn't a regular shadow. It looked solid and three-dimensional, but entirely black. When I went to bed that night, I heard my name called multiple times, but I knew everyone was asleep. When I woke up, my name was carved on the wood around my window. "6 years ago, my aunt moved into a new house. In the living room, there was a fist-sized hole in the wall. Across from the hole was a window, which had what appeared to be a bullet impact in it, but no hole. She covered the hole with a small pillow resting on the back of the couch. One day, I was hanging out with my young cousin, who would have been about 7 at the time. Out of the blue, she started talking to herself in gibberish. The only discernible word was the name Alan. I asked her what she was saying, and she cranked her head over at me and said, "I'm talking to Alan, see?" before going back to her gibberish. I happened to look to where the hole was, and saw that the pillow had been moved aside. I shoved the pillow over the hole, and my cousin stopped her gibberish and asked me what was wrong. She didn't seem to remember a single thing. I slept over that night in my cousin's room. After a while, in the darkness, I started to hear a male voice talking in gibberish. After listening for some time, I felt a hand on my face, ice cold. I screamed loud enough to wake everyone up, but nothing happened after that. I don't know if it's related, but the house was next door to a church. When I was 11, I was walking to a corner shop to get an ice cream cone. When I got there, I saw a kid my age that I didn't recognize. That was odd because it was a small town and we all knew each other. The kid looked sickly, hunched over, and with a similar haircut and body type to myself, minus the apparent poor health. I avoided him. I wasn't used to talking to kids I hadn't already met through school. Plus, he kind of set me on edge. I maneuvered past him, avoiding him as subtly and effectively as I could, which was difficult to do considering he was no more than 5 feet from the entrance to the store. As I was choosing my ice cream, I overheard a rasping cough from outside, which I assumed came from the kid. When I left the store and looked around, he was out there just staring at the rubbish bin. I started walking home when there was a rumble from the clouds overhead. I wasn't worried because it was still daylight and hadn't yet begun to rain. Suddenly, I heard a loud smack. I turned around and the kid had fallen down, or fainted, I'm not completely sure what happened, and hit his head on the side of the metal bin. I ran back to get the storekeeper, but he had already closed up. I realized I was going to have to help the kid, so I went over to see if he was conscious and help him up. He got up on his own just as I was about to reach him. looked straight at me and started grinding his teeth very loudly. I about crapped myself when I saw that, aside from the dark red gash in his temple, he wasn't just similar in appearance to me, but my dead ringer. I started to walk away, slowly at first, and reaching as fast a walk as I could manage without making it obvious that I was terrified. A sudden loud thunderclap made me double time it. I kept my eyes in front of me, having no idea if he was following me. When it started to rain, I considered it the perfect excuse to start running. Before long, I slipped and landed on my right knee so hard I could feel the stress in the bones on collision. I couldn't feel any pain. All I could think was that the kid must still be following me. Thanks to my screwed up knee, it took me twice as long as it should have to get home. Before I entered, I looked around and saw nobody. But the rain was falling fast now, and visibility was poor. I just couldn't shake the feeling that he had followed me home. My stomach sank at the thought that he might know where I live. Got inside, and my mom screamed when she saw me. My knee and the surrounding skin was black with bruising. That was when the pain hit me. 3 days later, I was lying in bed with a cast on. Turns out the bone was partially broken right below the knee. I heard it start to rain and pulled the curtains across slightly, just enough to see out the window to the rain, which I love, despite what had happened to me. Through all the trees in our front yard, I was just able to make out the kid on the footpath, looking towards the house. He turned and walked away. Once, I woke up at about 4 a.m. to the sun barely coming over the horizon. I decided to take a jog down the road while listening to some music. 98.9 The Rock FM. Nothing like good old classic rock. I made it to the 1.5 mile point and started jogging back. As I did, I passed my neighbor, who is also a loner corn farmer. Me and him never really got along, though. There was still a 1/2 mile to my house, and my radio turned to static. I got a phone call, and when I answered, it was my neighbor, whose house I had just passed by. He asked, "Who was that dude running behind you?" I figured he was screwing with me, so I decided to do it right back. "And that's my sister, bro." He replied in a serious tone, "Don't give me that, that was a dude." At this point, I was starting to get a little on edge. I asked him, "What?" I was kidding about my sister, but now I'm a little freaked out. I looked behind me, and there was no one. The phone call cut out, and the static started playing again. I sprinted back to my house and sat on my porch for a good 20 minutes with shotgun in hand. I decided to call my neighbor back and ask him what the person looked like. He told me it was a tall dude, wearing a bathrobe and carrying something that resembled a clock. I asked him what drugs he had been taking, and he hung up on me. I didn't sleep easy that night. I have a sink and mirror set up in my room across from my bed. It's a little odd, but I never paid it much mind because the room is a converted attic. I occasionally get creepy vibes up there, but nothing more than what I imagine most people get in the dark. Whenever I wake up in the middle of the night to pee, I usually just do it in the sink and rinse, being too lazy to go downstairs. A couple nights ago, I felt a little more creeped out than usual by my own silhouette in the mirror at 4 a.m. But I stared right at it, because that's how I deal with my fears. I'm a pretty sound sleeper, and went back to bed with no problem. It wasn't until morning that I remembered that I've had a buzz cut for a month now. My silhouette had my old hair. Back in the 6th grade, I hung out with this kid who was heavy into metal and horror. There was an old abandoned house across the street from my neighborhood, and my friend wanted to explore it. Anyways, I wasn't really hesitant at all about exploring, and agreed to do so. We visited the house many times, and never found anything out of the ordinary. Just a couple of moldy, corroded TV sets, worn-down walls. The usual you'd expect in a house that's been empty for what seemed to be decades. Anyways, we decided to visit the house one night several years later. I don't remember the time, but it was dark out. Again, nothing scary or creepy happened, and we ended up touring it for 15 minutes before leaving and heading home. A couple of days later at school, another friend of mine was showing a couple of people pictures on his phone. Of course, I was curious and asked what he had on it. Turns out, he had a picture of a faint skull peering out through the cracks of a deteriorated wall. He told me he had visited an old house which happened to be the same one that I had visited a couple days prior. Long story short, he took a picture of the house's interior and said that the skull hadn't appeared until after the picture was taken. It brings me chills to this day. I don't know if that house is haunted or not, but I've not been back to find out. I'm always buying things from thrift shops, like toys and other neat things. I found a stuffed koala bear that made strange grunting and moaning sounds when you squeezed it. Its eyes lit up with a blue light and black pupils. It was totally bizarre and I needed it. I bought it, took it home, and showed it to my mom and cousins. They all said it was creepy. Over time, people played with it and killed the batteries. It started growling and moaning in a bizarre deep voice, which made me like it even more. I was sitting with my cousins and my best friend when the bear started doing that growling and moaning. The eyes started blinking, and everybody stared at it until it stopped. A couple days later, the bear turned on, and the sounds it was making were even more bizarre. My cousin came out of his room and said he took the batteries out. I was confused because it was still turning on. He said he knew that because when people were sitting in the room, it would turn on and growl and blink its eyes. One day, when my friend was over, I let her hold it, and it turned on and started doing its growling. She started talking about how creepy it was, and I told her it was haunted. She didn't believe me, so I told her to check the batteries. She laughed and opened the battery case, and just like I said, there were none in there. That's one of my favorite I told you so's. I'm not sure if they still have that bear. It was one of my creepiest possessions. In the 90s, I lived in an old apartment building with my mom. It used to be a small 1960s resort, but now it's just a dumpy apartment building. A few things happened there. Here's the first story. It was very early in the morning, and my mom was still at her waitress job. I stood on the couch and looked out the window, and saw the in-ground pool with people in it. I was pretty excited to see some kids my age playing in the water, and then laid back down to watch some Johnny Bravo. I fell asleep on the couch, and when my mom came home, I asked her, "Can we go to the pool?" She said, "There's no pool here. They filled it up with dirt before you were even born." Second story. My mom went into the kitchen late one night and saw a kid looking through a cabinet next to the sink. She thought it was me and asked, "Why are you awake this late? Go to bed." She turned on the light, and no one was there, but the cabinet was left open. Third story. My mom and I were chilling in her room watching TV at night when we both heard an angry male's voice from the kitchen say, "I told you to make my dinner." Mom grabbed a baseball bat and went looking, but there was no one there. When I was 12, I had just moved to a new town and befriended a couple of neighborhood kids. They somehow came to the consensus that I needed to be initiated into their group. They dared me to go into the basement of an abandoned farmhouse 15 minutes away, which I agreed to because I wanted to make friends. That night, I made the walk down the old country road near the woods. It was pitch black, except for when cars would go by. I only had my phone to use as a light. The group waited outside while I headed in alone. It was creepy, but not too bad. After a while, I could hear one of the kids trying to sneak in to scare me. Their footsteps in the tall grass were super obvious. I called out, "It's not funny. This is dumb. Let's go." For a solid minute, there was an eerie silence. Then, I heard one of the kids yell, "All right, you can come out now," as I heard those footsteps approach from fairly far away. I left the barn to meet the kid, and he asked me something like, "Was it scary?" Before he stared at something behind me for a few seconds, then bolted into the woods. I caught up to him and the rest of the group, and he was crying hysterically. I asked him what he saw, and he just refused to describe it. 3 years later, when I was 15, I was still friends with those kids. I randomly remembered that night, and I asked him what he saw. He drew me this picture. He said the figure had one hand on the door, like it was peeping around the corner. Seeing this, with the memory of the event, sent chills down my spine. A few years ago, I was living next door to my grandma, who was in her 90s. I went one night to check up on her, opened the door, and walked upstairs to her room. She looked right at me and asked, "Who's the guy that came with you?" I looked back, and there was nothing there. I felt really creeped out on my walk back home. Another night, I went to check on her, and I could hear her talking to someone. I knew there was nobody there but her, and at this point I was used to things like this just because she's old. I heard her ask, "When am I going to die?" I was taken aback when a deep male voice answered, "Not yet." I left before she even knew I was there. She was a really weird lady, and was always going on about spirits. It still freaks me out, even though she died like 6 years ago. I used to walk home from work at a gas station. I worked the third shift, so I clocked in at 11 at night and left between 5 and 6 in the morning. It was, for the most part, a straight walk back to where I was staying at the time. On the other side of the street, about halfway back from the gas station, was a cemetery. It never really bothered me, but the house across the street from it did. I'd usually be on the phone or at least have headphones on to play music on the walk back, because I have anxiety about being out alone, so I need something to keep me calm. Once, as I was coming up on the house I didn't like, I heard a noise, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone on the doorstep dropping a box and starting to stand back up. It was a pitch-black figure with no defining features. As I continued to stare at them, they just stopped being there. That really freaked me out, and once I got past that house, I speed-walked the entire way back to my place. But that wasn't even the worst thing that's happened. The worst was this one time. I was walking back, and as I was coming up on that house, I had the feeling that there was someone jogging or running behind me. You know how sometimes, without even looking, you just understand that there's a body behind you, even though you didn't glance over? Especially when it's quiet out. So, I sensed this person on the sidewalk behind me, and I was feeling them get closer and closer to me as I was coming up on that stupid house. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh god, they're gonna run straight into me. Just hit me while full-on running. But like in a dream, I was physically unable to do anything but keep walking the pace I was, staying right on my same path. I just couldn't seem to move over off the sidewalk, and I wasn't able to look over my shoulder to see if they were really there. Then, right as I was bracing for impact from the person running behind me, nothing. I just kind of screamed in my head, maybe made some stupid choking or squeaking noise in person. But nothing hit me. It felt like they sort of sucked into my back and ceased to exist. I really hated that walk home from then on. I would refuse to even leave the gas station until someone answered the phone, and would stay on with me for the walk back. I wasn't dealing with that stuff without some sort of witness again. My parents divorced when I was 18. I'm 24 now. I was staying at my father's place in the middle of the Montreal winter. After a dinner with his side of the family, I walked in with my father and younger brother and headed to the bathroom. I heard my dad furiously yell, "Come on, next time you need to run in from the outside, at least take your boots off." I hollered from the bathroom, "It wasn't me," and my brother did the same from his room. He called us to the kitchen. There were muddy, slushy, dried boot prints heading from the front door all the way to the middle of the kitchen at the island. I told him those aren't my boot prints, and my brother said the same. He thought we were lying, so we brought him every shoe and boot in the house, including his. None seemed to match the prints. I asked my dad, "How many other people have the key to this place? Uncles? Cousins?" "Just us three." The alarm hadn't gone off, and I started to realize something even weirder. The footprints started inside the house, not at the entrance. They also stopped at the island. There were none moving away from it, and there was no smudging to indicate that whoever made the prints walked backwards or removed their boots. At this point, what we were looking at started to hit my father. He just cleaned up the prints and didn't want to bring it up again. This isn't that thrilling or exciting, but it is true. When I was 16, I was working part-time at a local optometrist's office. It was summertime, and the optometrist's office is in a giant hospital, with no windows in the office. I walked in from the parking lot where the sun was shining, birds were chirping, all typical of summer. Near the end of my shift, I was in the back in the kitchen trying to kill some time before I left so I wouldn't have to do any more work. I turned around and looked in the doorway, and I saw an arm waving at me, almost as if to say, "Come here." The arm was pale white and transparent. I looked around the corner past the doorway, and there was a transparent man standing there, dressed almost like Charlie Chaplin, with a cane and all. I blinked, and that was all the time it took for him to disappear. I freaked out and ran out to the front of the office. In that moment, I remembered back to a few weeks ago when the secretary was talking about a ghost that everyone sees. I asked her to describe the ghost again. She said he dresses like he's from the 40s, has a cane, and is very friendly. I said, "I just saw him." She said that everyone sees him. It's just a little odd that I did because he only comes out when it's raining outside. I clocked out to leave for the day and walked out to the parking lot, where it was pouring down rain. I'm a state police officer. I don't see a lot of weird stuff, but when I do, I remember it. I was on the graveyard shift, and around midnight, I got a report of a 1050 on one of the back roads, and I took the call. I turned off the highway and ended up in the middle of nowhere, and the road was turning from paved into dirt. I found the area where dispatch said the wreck was, but there was nobody around. No car, no accident, not even a cow. I asked dispatch if they had given me the right location. They said they had. I decided to drive another mile or two to look for it, and I came upon a guy walking into traffic with a gas can. I spotlighted him and got out of the vehicle, notifying dispatch. He explained that he had run out of gas, and his vehicle was on the side of the road just up ahead. I checked his ID through dispatch, and he came up clean. I asked him to get into the back for me and said I'd give him a ride after I checked for the previous accident. He obliged, and I got back in. We started a conversation, with him talking about what he does, his family, and I told him a little about myself as well. After a while, I caught something red in my headlights. It was the wreck dispatch was talking about. It had gone into a ditch and rolled over after clipping a boulder. I flipped my lights on and turned around to ask the guy to stay in the car for a moment. And I found that he wasn't in the back. I looked around outside with my flashlight, and he was nowhere to be found. The doors were still locked. I investigated the crash and notified dispatch for ambulance and tow truck. I looked in the cab, and the driver was the same guy I had picked up on the side of the road. He had died on impact. This is my own dumb fault, but do not ever screw around with cults thinking you'll be the one guy to make them look stupid and get people to quit or whatever. I was in California on a 2-night vacation when I passed by a place called the Church of Glory, End Times Brotherhood. I bumped my friend on the shoulder, and we decided it would be hilarious to walk in. The door was locked, and I held my face up to it while my friend was walking away. I couldn't see past the curtain in the window, but I was really curious about what was inside. As I did, the door clicked open. Standing in the doorframe was this stupidly tall guy who either had no eyelids or just never blinked. I realized that the curtain I had been looking at was his shirt. He had been standing there the whole time. And I looked to my friend to make an excuse, and he was long gone. The man asked me if he could help me, in one of those stupid, deep, tall person voices. I said, "No, I was just curious." He then said he would chase me if I walked away, with a big smile on his face, and assured me it wouldn't take long. Stupidly, I walked inside. He walked behind me to a group sitting at school chairs looking at a whiteboard. Some lady handed me a pamphlet. As I read it, everybody was staring at me, and they all looked really happy. They invited me to a group hug, which I accepted because the tall dude again assured me that he'd chase me, which got a laugh from the church. We hugged for like 10 minutes as they sang some crap in Hebrew or something. They told me all about the alien end times, and how the only way to survive is to love the teacher, so he can lead us to the final starship at the chosen time, once his disciples are in order. I insisted that I had to go back to my friend. The tall guy said, okay, but he'd still chase me. I ran out the door, and he didn't chase me. I didn't tell my friend about any of the crap that just happened. He just called me a wimp, and I kept it all to myself. I got back home a couple days later, and there was a letter in my freaking mailbox in Wisconsin from that church. I'm sure I hadn't filled out anything. The letter just said, I said I'd chase you. Over and over. Now I live in Texas. When I was a kid, about 8 years old or so, my family was too poor for cable TV, so it was just crappy rabbit ears antenna for us. My parents couldn't even afford to stick a real antenna on the roof, so that's all I had. There were like 30 channels, but most of them were static. Some of them had so much static that they showed almost in black and white. However, on rare days, depending on the weather and sunspot cycles, you could get channels from farther away and watch TV shows that you wouldn't normally get, but you would have to find the perfect spot and orientation for the rabbit ears, and it was very sensitive to even the slightest perturbations. Even someone in the next room walking around was enough to mess it up. A couple of things about this old TV creeped me out. There was one channel that was full of static, and it usually played infomercials. It looked like the distorted silhouette of a person. I pointed it out to other people in my family, and they saw it too. I used to randomly stare at it while playing with Legos, and it gave me shivers. Actually, I used to stare at channels that were 100% static, and I convinced myself that I could see patterns in the noise. My parents would tell me that there was nothing there. When I got older, I learned that it's an optical illusion, but at the time it scared me thinking that nobody else but me could see it. And then there's those emergency alert system disaster warning tests, and tornado and flood warnings from faraway places. As a kid, I never knew what was going on, so I was always scared I was about to die whenever I saw one of those. Now as I'm typing this, I remember one thing that was actually disturbing. If I went to one of the empty, static, high-numbered channels, usually early in the morning, the static would sometimes change to a bunch of weird lines. And then I would hear faint, distorted voices before going back to normal 10 seconds later. I awoke to the feeling of worms Screw you, Discord. Oh, and it's the Halloween theme, too. Jesus. Oh my god.